Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSat Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in Indian political thought we will be talking about Islamic and Syncretic Traditions. To discuss this topic we have with us our subject expert Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science in Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. Dr. Jha has 25 years of teaching experience and his area of expertise lies in Indian political thought and political theory. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, Sir.
Thank you, Amrit, and good afternoon. Today's lecture we are going to devote on Islamic and Syncretic Tradition in Indian political thought and thinking. In fact, when we talk of Islamic and Syncretic thinking or tradition, what comes to our mind that the whole host of ideas which developed in India, particularly after 10th century onwards or 9th century one can say, after the advent of a new set of belief system known as Islam, and then subsequently the way it interacted with the existing thought process, existing culture, social moorings, and in that process what happened that some sort of new thinking developed in India, and that thinking, of course, so far as the Islamic tradition is concerned, was largely based on the teachings or the messages or the ideas which are basically central to the entire Islamic discourse, particularly as it is available through Sharias and other things, particularly the Quranic verses and so on and so forth. So that is there, but what happened that some sort of dynamism also came into the process, and it was largely on account of the challenges which were emerging in the Indian context, particularly in light of its engagement with political power, political authority, and the question of legitimacy. It is definitely there that two important elements constituted this Islamic tradition in medieval period, and one was of course the element of, or basically one can say the dimension of theocracy, the theocratic state based on religious ideas, religious teachings, and number two, it tried to legitimize the power and authority of a monarch. So therefore, it basically justified a monarchical form of government. Now, so far as the monarchy is concerned, there was nothing new so far as Indian political thought is concerned, because earlier also we have seen in context of Hindu political thinking of that period or even which preceded it. In fact, monarchy was the popular and the dominant mode of thinking. In fact, most of the thinkers used to talk about or used to eulogize the power of monarch and the king. But here what we find, this combination of theocracy as well as this monarchy in fact became very important for this entire tradition in political thinking, what we normally call the Islamic political tradition or in Islamic political tradition. In course of our lecture, we will also take into account the syncretic tradition, and that syncretic tradition in fact is a tradition which emerged or evolved as a result of interaction between two different types of social, political and cultural processes. And normally when we talk of syncretic tradition, we imply by syncretic tradition the two important movements of the medieval period. One is the Bhakti movement, another is the Sufi movement or Sufism as it is known. So therefore, this syncretic tradition had persisted. In fact, it emerged from the civil society. It basically found its place among the people. It's articulated the aspirations, the needs, the views and the feelings and the values of the people, and therefore it survived. It has survived till this date, in fact, in different forms. For example, in Indian political tradition, so much so that Indian constitutional discourse after 1947, the way the constitution was framed, many people feel that it also reflects that syncretic tradition, the harmony of different faiths, harmony of different value system. Even in the national movement, many scholars argue that was a reflection of that syncretic tradition in culture, in society, in ideas. So, therefore, this syncretic tradition also emerged later, and therefore, it was not purely based on the Islamic political thinking, it was not purely based on the Islamic thought or Islamic ideas. In fact, it of course became important component of it, because as it is well known that when we talk of syncretic tradition, we, as I mentioned, that we normally mean two things, the Islamic and the Bhakti and the Sufi, and the Sufi tradition came from the Islam. So, that is one thing, but before we go to that syncretic tradition, we have to first of all see this Islamic and syncretic tradition, Islamic tradition to begin with. Now, when we talk of Islamic tradition, we should also remember that in fact, we are talking of two different types of Islamic traditions. One tradition which emerged in fact in medieval period. In fact, medieval period, when we talk of medieval period, particularly after the birth of Islam, and when it arrived in India, it basically infused new energy, new ideas into the existing thought process and thought structure. So, therefore, when we talk of Islamic tradition, normally we imply two different time period. One is the medieval period, and that is normally the pre-colonial period, and in that period, of course, we have some sources, some writings to basically see that how this Islamic tradition was taking shape in India at that time. And two important thinkers who are considered or who are used normally, their writings are used to explain this tradition, particularly in the medieval period. One is Barni, another is Abu Fazl. In fact, of course, they are separated by centuries, but nonetheless they tell us something very significant about two important periods, political periods in medieval Indian history. One the Sultanate, another the Mughal period. But at the same time, when we talk of this Islamic tradition, we also basically talk of a later part of Indian history, that is the colonial period, and particularly in terms of its engagement with certain new challenges, new issues, particularly modernity, nationalism, colonialism, and so on and so forth. So, therefore, Islam as a continuing tradition, we find that in fact, when it came to engage with the new challenges, new reality in India, that is colonialism, nationalism, and modernity, it basically came out with certain new responses, and therefore, we will also see that how those responses can be understood and how those responses can be seen. But before that, let us start with this medieval basically tradition, the Islamic tradition in the medieval period. And here, in fact, one thing we should keep in mind, that it is basically fixed in historic time. The first 40 years after the birth of Prophet, in fact, that becomes the reference point of political theory of power and authority in this tradition of political thought, because this period is considered to be the most virtuous period, in fact, the right period without any sins, and therefore, that became an ideal type, ideal system, what the Greeks normally used to talk of ideal state. So, therefore, one thing is very important for this tradition, that the first 40 years from particularly 1622 to 1661 AD, that becomes the reference point of this entire tradition and entire thinking. The later period is considered to be something which degenerated because of decline in the value system and so on and so forth. Of course, so far as this tradition is concerned, in fact, the two sources, one can say, acted as important basis for the evolution or development of this tradition. One is, of course, the Hebrew prophets, and the second is the teachings of Muhammad. In fact, from this first, one can say that this concept of one God as a ruler or a lawgiver comes into this entire discourse. But so far the second tradition is concerned, the teachings of Muhammad, particularly the Muslims who are basically the believer in Islam, they believe that they are directly related to this one God through their Prophet Muhammad. So therefore, these two important sources one can figure out so far as this Islamic tradition is concerned. Now, in fact, if you look at the features of this Islamic tradition, particularly in early years in India, one finds there certain dimensions, certain aspects in this tradition which basically stand out when we explain or when we discuss this tradition. First of all, we find that it is highly exclusive in nature. So far the political doctrine is concerned, exclusivity is perhaps the central feature of this entire discourse. Of course, one should not forget that the concept of equality, particularly through the concept of Islamic brotherhood, because this entire doctrine is based on this idea that every human being is a son of a God, and therefore this concept of brotherhood, Islamic brotherhood emerges. This communitarian aspect of this life, that man is a part of a social or a religious community, and therefore there is a concept of brotherhood. And since this concept of brotherhood is quite important for this tradition, so therefore the concept of equality also becomes important. And it is here one finds that this new element entering into the Indian political thinking through this Islamic tradition around that period of time, because as it is commonly understood that the Indian political tradition as it existed in the pre-Islamic period was not premised on this concept of equality, rather it believed and legitimized a hierarchical social order. So hierarchy was basically the rule, not the equality. So therefore this concept of equality. The next thing is that it believes that the king is the representative of God, and that is something what normally we understand in political theory as this concept of the origin of the state. And therefore this how this monarch is considered to be the representative of divine origin theory of the state, that monarch is the representative of God. So God is speaking through monarch, and therefore the legitimacy of the power and authority of monarch comes from this sort of relationship with the God, and therefore the Islamic tradition also talked of this. And there is nothing surprising in it, because as I mentioned, the two important hallmarks of this tradition, one was theocracy, another was monarchy, and therefore both played equally important role in providing this dimension to this tradition. Now apart from this understanding king as the representative of God, this tradition also what it did, that incorporated a lot of practices of local sects and the people. So therefore of course the central ideas came from the Shariat doctrines, it came from the Quran, it came from the preachings and the teachings of Prophet Muhammad, but nonetheless it also incorporated many practices of local sects and the people. So therefore this continuous process of interaction continued, and therefore this is also very important to remember. Now here I would like to mention one thing, that it is normally understood that in India there is those who are believer in Islam, they are highly homogeneous group. There is no inner differentiation, and this is perhaps one of the misconceptions that has to be removed, because the Islamic society, like any other society in India, like any other community in India, is not homogeneous, rather highly heterogeneous. They are divided along number of lines. For example, even if you take into account the dimension of caste and class, we find that there are 3-4 important strata among them. For example, Ashraf, Azlaf, Arjal, the 3 important strata emerging, equivalent to something what we find in Hindu caste system. Similarly, in terms of the sects, they are also divided between Shias and the Sunnis, which are basically the common division among the Muslims world over. Similarly, in terms of the juridical divide, in terms of the belief and the faith in the law, particularly the kind of legal system they work with, we find that they are divided among Hanafi, Hanawali, Safil and the Maliki. So therefore, the 4 different systems of laws. Even in terms of ethnic divisions or lineages, in fact there are some quite important such divisions like Bohras and Maplas. Even in terms of linguistic and regional divisions, we find that there are number of diversities among them. So, therefore, it is a kind of misconception that it is highly homogeneous. And here what I was mentioning earlier, that this incorporation of the local practices, practices of local sects and the people contributed to great extent. The next important element is the idea of Islamic brotherhood, and this was encouraged. This encouraged the ideal of freedom through communal existence. And one can say that this perhaps was quite a radical doctrine, because this concept of fraternity, the brotherhood, and particularly the idea of freedom, in fact, which was encouraged through this communal existence, was something quite noble and radical. Now, another important dimension, and perhaps this is also not surprising, because they believed in the supremacy of one God. They believed in the supremacy of teachings of the prophet, the messenger of God. They believed in the sanctity and supremacy of the Quran, and therefore they gave limited role to reason. Rather, they believed that the faith perhaps is the only way human beings can negotiate and mediate with the external world. So, therefore, this limited role to reason is another important characteristic of this political thinking, now of this tradition, and perhaps this was the reason that some sort of dogmatism we often find in this tradition emerging from time to time. So, therefore, one can say that these features of Islamic tradition, particularly in early years in India, basically in these terms we can see that they are there. Now, what happens that this this Islamic tradition in this period was interacting with the indigenous, or one can say the tradition which existed or predated it, and therefore, this interaction resulted into a number of things, and lot of scholars believe that these interactions sometimes resulted into certain negative and certain positive, both dimensions, negative as well as positive, and we will basically look at these dimensions when we will round up this part of our discussion, that is Islamic tradition. But one thing is important, that in fact how to understand this entire medieval Islamic tradition in India, because one thing is very important, that there are few political empires, or one can say that certain kingdoms which emerged, and certain intellectuals or certain traditions of thinking also emerged around that time to legitimize the power and authority of those kingdoms, those kings and those rules. And particularly two important periods here are to be noted. One is the Sultanate period, another is the Mughal period, and we find that the two important thinkers in these two periods played important role in terms of giving us some idea that what type of tradition was taking shape here, on basis of course, this universal idea of Islam, or the Quranic tradition which was taking shape in different countries. Now, Indian context, what we find that one such thinker was in fact Abu Barni, and Barni belonged to the medieval period. He belonged to the Sultanate period, and he lived a period when Islam was finding roots in India. Now, Barni's of course life is quite checkered in the sense that toward the end of his career he was basically discarded and by the power who was, or the authority who was ruling at that time, and therefore he basically wrote certain treatises around that time, and some of the treatises have become important source for us to understand the working of both the state system as well as the understanding that what type of Islamic tradition was developing around that time. Now, Barni tried to give a rational basis for just government, and while giving this rational basis for just government, he in fact went to the extent of even to some extent justifying a number of things which in Islamic tradition can be considered evil, but he did not consider them to be evil, and that is something quite interesting. Though in fact, one of the scholars B.R. Mehta, he believes that justice and moderation, these were the two important hallmarks of Burmese political thought, and he in fact goes to the extent of saying that Aristotle's impact on the Islamic political thinking around that time, because the kind of impact the Greek thinkers had on the Arab political thinking in fact was important source through which they were also basically getting influenced. But nonetheless, one finds that Barney tried to give a rational basis for just government. Another important dimension of Barney's political thought was his religious fanaticism. In fact, he believed in imposition of faith by force, even on those who basically did not subscribe or not easily agreeable to the teachings, and therefore, this religious fanaticism was hallmark of Burmese political thought. In fact, he considered a monotheism, a belief in one God, which perhaps is important dimensions of Islamic political tradition, and anyone who deviating from that tradition, he thought that he was kafir, and therefore needed to be punished, and therefore he had to be brought into submission. So therefore, this kind of fanaticism was another important hallmark of his political thought. He developed a theory of government for Muslims only. For example, he did not consider other living in Indian society to be important for the statecraft, for the state system, for political power, and therefore his entire ideas were geared towards one community, one religious group, and therefore sometimes many scholars believe that Barney was a thinker with a sectarian mindset, not a kind of syncretic or the pluralist mindset which some of the other Islamic thinkers in the later period demonstrated. Now, of course, as I mentioned, that justice and moderation, as B.R. Mehta has pointed out, were the important hallmark of Barney, but sometimes one also finds that justice and moderation, of course, are important values, but they get abandoned in his political thinking. Now, of course, Barney was against reason and science, and there is nothing surprising it, because he like any other medieval thinker, gave primacy to faith. Now, he believed that king can even use the evil method in service of religion, and therefore, in Barney's opinion, the king's job are number A, enforcement of Shariat, number 2, check on immoral acts, number 3, dispensing of justice, and therefore, all these acts and actions can qualify a king as a good sultan, and therefore Barney provided the basis for a theocratic state around that time in India. So therefore, we find that through Barney's writings we get some idea that what type of Islamic tradition was taking shape in India so far as this theocracy is concerned. Now, another thinker who is Abu Fazl, he came later, in fact 1551. In fact, he was minister in Akbar's court. Now, Abul Fazl Akbari is also an important source for understanding the tradition, Islamic tradition of that period. Of course, it is qualitatively different from Barney in terms of its sectarian and in terms of its theocratic ideas. Of course, with Abu Fazl we find the rudiments of a new and a more liberal and human approach emerging, and Fazl, religious difference for him, religious difference is not to be allowed to destroy harmony in the society, and political ideas, of course, when we look at the Fazl's ideas, we find that he had a contempt for tyranny. Now, even in the book Akbari, Abu Fazl lays the foundation for or gives some idea of pattern of administration during Akbar's time period. So therefore, Barney and Fazl, two important sources to see that how in Islamic tradition was taking shape in India around that period of time. this session, we will be discussing that how Abu Fazl's writings and ideas in fact tell us something about the Islamic tradition which was taking shape in India. Of course, we have had other thinkers who preceded Abu Fazl, and his in their writings are equally important, but Abu Fazl comes at a very crucial point of time in Indian history, when certain new thought processes started in Indian society, because he was the minister in Akbar's court, and Akbar who was a kind of king or a ruler who is basically marked out in terms of his entire approach towards governance, his entire approach towards dealing with people from different faiths and so on and so forth. So much so that many people believe that Akbar was also the progenitor of this idea of syncretism from above, if not from below. We will basically take up this issue later. So, therefore, Abu Fazl is an important thinker of this period, and his book, particularly Ain-e-Akbari, is important source to understand both his ideas, his thought, as well as the period and the society in which he was writing. Now, of course, as I we know that he had a contempt for tyranny. Now, pattern of administration he talks is basically through this entire book Ain-e-Akbari, and therefore, the kind of religious difference, this statement that religious difference is not to be allowed to be destroyed for the harmony of the society is quite significant. That what type of new thinking was getting infused into or getting injected into this entire Islamic tradition around that period of time. It started as a pure sectarian political thinking, theocracy and monarchy, of course, they continued even with these thinkers like Abu Fazl, but certain new refreshing ideas started coming into existence. And therefore, what Abu Fazl writes and what we find getting practiced through the rule of or through the reign of Akbar, one can find a very close correspondence. So, therefore, Barni writing in a Sultanate period, number of Sultanate sultans around that time who were trying to establish a new tradition of political power and authority, and therefore, the kind of intellectuals who surrounded them, and Barni of course was one of them, and the kind of ideas they were putting forth, that tells you that what type of tradition was taking shape around that time. And later on, after 300 years, we find that a different tradition was in process of emergence. So, therefore, we find that Abu Fazl's ideas are equally important. Now, what in fact happened that this medieval Islamic tradition, as we have seen, that was taking shape in India largely on account of the fact that a new faith system arrived here, and therefore, it injected new elements in society, in culture, in politics. Now, of course, as you have seen, and many scholars believe that this tradition had both negative and positive fallouts. In terms of negative fallouts, scholars argue that certain practices in Indian society, even if they were there, got further hardened, including the Parda system, caste system, and exclusivity in terms of social and cultural ideas and thinking. But at the same time, there are certain positive elements as well, and those positive elements are to be remembered, because those positive elements basically brought a new and refreshing ideas in Indian society and Indian culture. And one, of course, was the syncretic tradition, particularly Bhakti and the Sufi movement, because this Bhakti and Sufi movements, a lot of people believe, a lot of scholars believe that they were the fallout of this close interaction between the two different traditions, the Islamic and the Hindu traditions, two faith systems, two different faiths, and therefore, they came into contact with each other, and therefore, this Bhakti and Sufism emerged, whereas mysticism of Hinduism and monotheism of Islam, these two things became the hallmark of these two movements. So, therefore, whereas Hinduism provided mysticism, Islam brought monotheism, and their synthesis ultimately resulted into this syncretic tradition in Indian political thinking as we normally understand as Bhakti and Sufi. Its impact on music, literature and art of course was phenomenal, which has survived even till today. So, now from the medieval we can see that how this Islamic tradition was a continuing tradition, and therefore, when it entered this modern period, certain new factors came into play, and those factors also influenced these ideas of or this tradition, because this new challenges, the new issues, new reference points in fact were very important in the new context. Of course, without diluting certain core principles or the core ideas of Islam, because that was of course there, but of course the new challenges required new response pattern, and as a result of this we find that this entire colonialism and nationalism became important dimension of this Islamic tradition in modern period. Now, of course, the three important concerns in modern periods of our Islamic tradition is concerned where one, relation between faith and modernity, that how faith has to come in terms with this question of modernity as particularly was being spread from the Western discourse, Western society. Number two, the relation between revelation and the plurality of the belief and culture, that is the national movement. Particularly in context of national movement, this dimension was important. The relationship between revelation and the plurality of belief and culture, that how they have to be harmonized, what type of relationship has to be decided. And in this context, we find that six perspectives emerged among the scholars, thinkers, protagonists of this religion, and particularly one can say that those who were trying to respond to those challenges took six different forms, and those six different forms in the modern context, in the context of the colonial India, particularly the Islamic, within Islamic tradition, one can present it as the Islam. One perspective looked at Islam within the paradigm of modernity, in fact wanted to harmonize Islam with the modernity, and this is what we normally associate with the Aligarh movement and the Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. And therefore, this is very important, because the challenge which was coming from modernity and the earlier perspective that this entire Islamic tradition looked at reason with contempt, basically dismissed reason as one important faculty of human beings, but here we find that a new kind of churning is taking place, and modernity and Islam, teachings of Islam, they are being harmonized. So, therefore, this is a new tradition emerging in modern period so far as this Islamic tradition is concerned. The second perspective also taking shape around the same time is Islam as a continuing tradition, and therefore believed in retaining the original features of Islam without basically making any modification in terms of its engagement with modernity, and it is here we can say that Deoband school and other basically came into picture. The third was that modernity under Muslim nation state, and it is here that the Jinnahs, Muhammad Ali Jinnah's political thought became important, that how modernity can be basically domesticated within the Muslim nation state. Therefore, a nation state governed and ruled by the Muslims, how this modernity can also be harmonized with this, and therefore, this entire tradition of thought basically took this issue very seriously. The next dimension was modernity fused with Islam, and here basically Iqbal's political idea becomes very important, because it believed that there was nothing antithetical between modernity and Islam, rather modernity is part and parcel of Islam, and therefore it is fused with Islam. Modernity has to be moderated with the teachings of Islam, instead Islam getting moderated by the teachings of modernity. In fact, Iqbal believed that if modernity gets fused with the teachings of Islam, or ideas and values of Islam, modernity is to be a gainer. So, therefore, this is the next perspective. And then you have equality of all religious pursuits within single nation state, unlike Jinnah was Maulana Azad. So, therefore, this was another political tradition of political thinking which was taking shape. And finally, this integral Islam, or what we normally call these days political Islam of Abdul Allah Madudi, in fact was another aspect of this entire tradition, which believed that Islam is a continuing tradition, and therefore, in fact there is no need for any modification and so on and so forth. So, therefore, these 6 different perspectives tell us that how in the colonial context, in the modern period, the Islamic tradition which has emerged in medieval time basically had a very long and checkered journey, and finally reached a point when it had to deal with certain new challenges, and in response to those challenges it came out with certain other perspectives, and therefore it gave rise to a kind of a tradition which is very important for understanding both modern Indian political process, modern Indian political tradition, and modern political institutions in India. Now, after looking at this Islamic tradition, the next issue which we have to discuss is the syncretic tradition, as I was mentioning earlier. Now, this syncretic tradition is a tradition which basically is based on the harmony of among number of ideas in the value systems, and the 2 important value systems which are harmonized within this syncretic tradition is the ideas or the faith system known as Islam, and the faith system that is known as Hinduism. Now, this Bhakti tradition or the Bhakti movement of course essentially started among the believers and the followers of Hinduism, whereas Sufism emerged among the believers in Islam. But nonetheless, one finds that there are a lot of common grounds so far as this Bhakti and Sufi traditions are concerned, and therefore, at times it is argued that these 2 movements were building or giving laying the foundation for a new tradition, political tradition in India, which is called syncretic tradition, a tradition which is believed or which is based on the harmony of number of value system. It is basically a tradition which celebrates pluralism and plurality of thought and plurality of social practices. It is a tradition which basically one can say that believes in the coexistence of multiple cultures and multiple ideals, and world over this syncretic tradition today is celebrated. But India can basically take pride in the fact that in the medieval period this tradition was taking shape, and that was largely on account of the fact that the way religion was responding to social issues and social challenges. Now, this syncretic tradition, as I was mentioning, is normally seen from the point of view of 2 different processes, from above and from below. Now, so far as the from below is concerned, of course, it is well known that Bhakti and the Sufism, they emerged among people in the civil society. It was people's quest for a liberation, emancipation, and therefore its emergence was from below. Whereas, on the other hand, there was also a kind of syncretism which in India was taking shape on the behest of the state power, and that's why it is called that it was coming from the above. And it is here the 2 important iconic figures in Indian history are cited. One is Ashok, the Mauryan king Ashok, and another is the Mughal emperor Akbar. And therefore, these 2 periods in Indian history are celebrated as the period which basically tried to give rise to this idea of syncretism. Now, this Akbar and Ashok, because Ashok, as converted to Buddhism, but there are a lot of evidences to suggest that Ashok gave lot of autonomy and freedom to even different sects in his in his kingdom, didn't persecute them. In fact, as if there was one sect which was continuously fighting with the Buddhism, but nonetheless, in fact, he not only patronized that sect, gave autonomy and freedom to that sect, but also erected one rock, there is a rock edict in basically commemorating or in the memory of that particular sect. So, that tells that how the king was trying to patronize different ideas, trying to patronize different sects. In fact, this dhammas, entire question of dhammas, in fact, A.L. Basham, one of the scholars writing on India, he believes that Ashoka's dhamma was not purely a Buddhist doctrine, rather it was a kind of doctrine which believed in the coexistence of number of sects and number of ideals. And similarly, Akbar, as it is well known, went to the extent of basically founding a new religion called Deen-e-Ilahi, based on the best aspects of all religions, existing religions, and therefore he wanted to create a faith system, or wanted to create a value system for human beings based on the best what is best available in all religions of the world. So, therefore, one can say that this type of syncretism emerging in two different periods in Indian history, one ancient, another medieval from the above. But so far as this syncretism from the below is concerned, the two movements are quite significant. One is the Sufism, another is Bhakti, and both brought new forms of religious expression among Muslims and Hindus. Now, Sufis, to begin with, they were mystics. In fact, they called for liberation in Islam. They emphasized egalitarianism and universal love. In fact, they did not want to create any new religion. Rather, they wanted a kind of liberalism, or the liberal values and liberal ideas to take shape within Islam. And therefore, one can say that Sufism was trying to reform Islamic faith and Islamic religion by bringing new ideas into it, particularly by keeping this idea of monotheism at the center of its entire discourse. It was trying to basically make the religion accessible to people, and therefore, the medium through which the Sufi saints wanted to communicate, those mediums were the people's language, the people's idiom. And therefore, what one finds that most of the Sufi saints were working among the downtrodden for their upliftment. They basically completely detested political power, maintained distance from the kings and the emperors, because they wanted to work and work for the people and work among the people. So, therefore, this is how we find this Bhakti Sufi tradition taking shape in of course, Sufism did not emerge in India, it came from outside, but nonetheless when it reached India around 12th century, what we find that Sufism acquired a new phase, a new dimension, and so much so that, as we will be mentioning here, the number of silsilas were started in India. So, therefore, this is something about Sufism. So, but the Bhakti saints are concerned, they transformed Hinduism by introducing devotion or Bhakti as a means to attain God, and it was a kind of reaction against number of evil practices which had basically taken shape in Indian society, particularly within Hinduism, particularly idolatry. You had the system where the priesthood, the caste system, and number of such practices excluded large number of people from the purview of this faith, and they subjugated. It was being used as a medium or a tool to subjugate large number of people, and therefore, this Bhakti tradition emerged as a kind of protest, as a rebellion, a kind of protesting voice against the kind of practices, social practices which were being done in name of religion. So, therefore, there is nothing surprising in this, that most of the Bhakti saints were against caste system, because the kind of rigidity which had entered into the Indian social system due to the caste system, the kind of hierarchical social order which was being legitimized through the teachings of Hinduism, these saints basically started attacking it. Not only that, the kind of monopoly the priestly class was exercising on the both spiritual and the material power, these Bhakti saints also basically questioned it. Now, they brought not only they questioned the Hindu, the kind of evil practices within Hinduism, but they also tried to bring Hindus and Muslims nearer to each other in social terms, and therefore, this was perhaps one important contribution of this tradition. And that is why when we talk of this Bhakti tradition, the moment we talk of Kabir, the moment we talk of Nanak, in fact we remember that how they were trying to create a different type of tradition of political thinking at that time, the kind of syncretic tradition which we are discussing at the moment. Now, they use local languages of the people, because the Sanskrit of course was the language of the elites, but they basically they provided a new framework to this Sanskrit, the language of elites, and also turned it into medium for more reforms and more social interaction and social exchange and intercourse. So, therefore, in fact they worked, they basically talked, they discussed, they spoke in the languages of the people. They tried to make religion accessible to the common folks. Therefore, what we find that the Bhakti and the Sufi saints became popular among the downtrodden, and that was the reason that the religion, which was earlier being used as a tool to legitimize oppression, which was being used as a tool to legitimize the power which was not in interest of the people, was turned into a different medium, because it became a source of salvation, and the intermediary role of the priestly class was not only challenged and questioned, but totally abandoned. And therefore, now in name of one God, the monotheism, that people through their own effort can access God, this was a kind of approach which appealed to the ordinary people in India. So, therefore, this Bhakti and the Sufi, these two movements played important role. Now, the Sufism, of course, because in Islam there are many religious and spiritual movements within, and Sufism was not the only one. Of course, there are many such movements, and these movements mostly centered on the interpretations of Quran. And as we know that the two sects which are there within Islam, that is Shias and Sunnis, and that is also present in India. So, in fact, as I mentioned in the very beginning, that this is a misconception that Islamic doctrines or the Islamic society or Islamic political thought is highly homogeneous. There have been number of ideas contending ideas within it. Now, Sufism, greatest challenge to this greatest challenge to orthodox Sunnism came from the rationalist philosophy of Mutazilas, and he practiced and professed a strict monotheism. But this challenge was immediately opposed by another school of thought, and it was called Ash'ari school, founded by Abdul Hasan Ash'ari. 1873 to 1935 was his time period. Now, the greatest exponent of this school, who later on became one of the famous Sufi saint, was Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, 1015 to 1111, and he reconciled the orthodoxy and the mysticism and became a Sufi saint. So, therefore, in fact, what happened that Sufis owed allegiance to Quran as much as ulemas did. So, this is not to be misunderstood here, that they were against the Quranic teachings. They believed and owed allegiance to the Quran as much as any ulemas, the orthodox ulemas perhaps believed in. Now, Sufism in India, what happened that one can say that Sufism came, as I was mentioning, from outside, but once it reached in India, what happened, that kind of mysticism which was prevalent within Hinduism played important role in shaping this new movement within Islam. Now, these Sufi saints were shocked at the degeneration of political and religious life, particularly degeneration in terms of the value system, the kind of degeneration they could see, that even if egalitarianism was the principle, but nonetheless it believed that lot of inequalities were basically existing there. So, therefore, in fact, both Bhakti and the Sufi saints simultaneously talked about social reforms and the religious reforms. They became source of, one can say, the kind of messenger for social reforms in India at that time, whether it was the sati system, so far as the Bhakti saints were concerned, sati system, child infanticide, or similar other practices, or kind of the operations, or the kind of inegalitarian society which was being created in name of caste system, they continuously oppose. And not only that, both types of discourses, Sufism as well as Bhakti, they oppose the vulgar display of wealth, and they preferred ascetic life of a sannyasi. And this sannyasi's life, of course, was their part of this Hinduism as well, but they provided a new dimension to this entire ascetic thinking. Now, they championed and propagated free thought and liberal ideas. They were against formal worship, rigidity and fanaticism of religion, which we saw in the political ideas of Barney and other thinkers of the medieval period. Now, they believed that meditation is the best way to achieve salvation, and the salvation or the God cannot be approached or attained through the mediation of the priests and the ulemas. So, therefore, this was a very important assertion both by the Sufi saints as well as the Bhakti saints. Now, the Sufis, when came to India, they established different silsilas, and silsilas can be known as orders, and those silsilas had peers at its top. The peers, one can say that they were the guide, the philosopher, or a kind of basically they were the ones who were showing the new path to the followers and the believers. Now these peers mostly lived in khankas, basically the kind of ascetic home they had, and they were also eligible for nominating their successors, which they did from time to time. Important to remember that they were not setting up new religion, but they were trying to liberalize Islam. In India, in 11th and 12th century, we find that this Sufi movement was gaining ground, and gradually it was becoming a popular movement among the people. The early Sufis in India, who basically the first generation, one can say, was Al-Hiwari, and he died in 1089. Now, the Sufis were divided into two different groups. One was Basara, and they followed the Islamic law, the Sharia laws. They believed in Nawaz. They offered, they observed Rozas, and they were called Basara. And they were divided, these silsilas, they were divided in 4 or 5 different groups. And they were the Chistis, Surawardis, Firdausi, Qadri, Naqshbandi, and so on and so forth. And the other was the Beshara. They were bound by the Sharias, and they were not bound by Sharias, and they were the Kalandhars, belong to this group. So, therefore, the Sufism, as we have mentioned earlier, that provided basically the basis for this syncretic tradition in India. Similarly, the Bhakti tradition, which emerged in 17th to 12th century in Tamil Nadu, particularly the Nayanars, the devotees of Shivas, and Alvars, were the devotees of Vishnus, wrote in local languages. Sanskrit was given a new form. Bhagavad Puran of 19th century, that was basically a discourse about Krishna's childhood exploits to explain the deep philosophy in simple terms, became perhaps the important reference point for this tradition, that is Bhakti tradition. This work became the turning point of the Vaishnavite movement. Now, the method of spreading their ideas, the Bhakti saints, mostly local languages, for example, Jan Dev in Marathi, Kabir in Surdas and Tulsi in Hindi, Shankar Dev in Assami, Chaitanya and Chandidas in Bangla, and Mirabai in Hindi and Rajasthani. So, therefore, we find that ideas of the Bhakti saints were mostly for salvation. They came from diverse background, from the lower caste background, from the downtrodden. In fact, the Kabir had a very syncretic origin, born of a Hindu widow, abandoned and brought up by Muslim parents. So, therefore, the Nanak had the similar background. From a downtrodden background. So, most of these saints came from the bottom of the society. They could understand the miseries and basically the ills which were afflicting the society. Therefore, they attacked institutional religion and advocated social reform. And therefore, at a time when pure social reforms, had not acquired a political, form, these saints, Bhakti saints, provided a medium through which Indian society and Indian religion could be reformed and could be taken forward. Of course, the Bhaktis were also divided into two groups, the Sakar and Nirakar. and therefore we find that this way this syncretic tradition took form shape in India through Sufism and the Bhakti movement. I will stop here.
Okay, on that note, I would like to thank sir for this very interesting discussion, and I would like to thank you dear friends for watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.